Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our 14th century Kampong City New Paradigm for Sustainable Cities discussion. And I think it's great to see so many of you interested in this amazing topic. And today we're really fortunate to have you here. We are extremely honored to have on my left-hand side, Mr. Clement. He is the Chief Curator of the Asian Civilization Museum. In fact, he has curated some really amazing exhibition and written a number of really insightful books on the history of this region and also of the material culture, the collection that are evidence of the richness and wealth of this region in the last 1,000 years. Now then, further left is still this, but believe me, further left, we've got Dr. Barnabas Calder. Yes, here he is. So he's real. Now, Dr. Barnabas Calder, he's Senior Lecturer at Liverpool University. He's also the Chairman of the group of British architectural historians. And his most recent book, Architectural History from the ancient history to from prehistory to climate emergency, published by Penguin, is hailed by Professor Florent Dubin as the most significant publication of architectural history in recent years. And in fact, secretly, I tell you, he has been hailed as the new Sir Nicholas Pevsner, who is the rock star of architectural history. Yes. Barnabas looked at architectural history from a sustainability carbon viewpoint. So it's a completely new way to look at our history. So really, today the topic is about this 14th century cities. In fact, if you look at some of these pictures on the wall that we have been kind of looping, and also some of these drawings in the exhibition, you would by now realize that 800, 900 years ago, there was already amazingly sophisticated, vibrant, rich culture happening in this part of Asia, this region of Asia. And people came from all over the world. Just a couple of days ago, I was walking around the Asian Civilization Museum, all the galleries. So I highly recommend a visit. If you have half a day spare this weekend, do visit. Exquisite jewelry, woven cloth from India, wonderful ceramics, of course, from China. All of these were evidence of a vibrant trading zone 700, 800 years ago, even before the European first stepped foot in this region. So why did it happen? I mean, very few people talk about it. Yeah, because most people talk about the maritime Silk Road. A lot of people talk about the age of discovery as if this region need to be kind of discovered by the Portuguese. Why did it happen? I mean, how did it come about? Clement, can you tell us a bit about the origin of this region and what happened then?
Well, good evening, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Chris, and the OVO team for inviting me to be part of the panel session tonight. And secondly, again, thanks to Chris for making a pitch for the Asian Civilization Museum. The ACM, if you have been to the museum, or if not, please come and visit us. It's unique in a way that, how we curate and we set up the galleries is thematic. So one of the floors we talk about maritime trade, And with maritime trade, very naturally, the sort of history of different port cities and the networks of how certain port city connect is extremely important to us. And again, I can't sum it up better than how Chris have done it. That before the 14th century, within Asia itself, there is already heavy amount of trade that happens between the different Asian countries or islands, between islands. They're of course much more smaller scale. And by the time 16th century, where the Europeans, where the Western powers start to came in, of course it reaches to a much more global impact. But the emphasis again started before that, and again there are very important powers and kingdoms that reside in this region, in Southeast Asia, China, India, the Middle East as well, that we try to sort of uncover. I think the center focus is when we look at port cities, we have to go back to why these are unique, and partly because of the geographical positioning of these port cities, and because they're strategically positioned in some ways that enables the flow of people, goods, ideas, and with the coming of people, it brings their beliefs and ambition as well. And these are some of the topics that we try to tease out in the museum. And in a way, when you look at all these kind of exchanges between Asia and the rest of the world, you're also looking at the very nature of our Singaporeans today, that ultimately Singapore is also a port city founded by trade, and all the significance that how we ourselves as global citizens also connect to a wider history, wider world. So I hope that...
So how were these cities organized? Were they big empire, or were they organized in some other ways? Were they centrally controlled?
There were big empires. I mean, if you're talking about, like the Ayutthaya period, if you're talking about certain kingdoms in Cambodia, or even earlier, like the Srivijaya empires as well, there are certain consolidated empires, but there are also more localized chieftains who are running and connecting certain trades in a lower scale. For example, like in the Philippines, a lot of the Luzon Islands, they're also moving trade in their own capacity as well. And there are also intermediaries to play, like playing the middleman to trade for them as well. So it's a very complex movement of people and goods during that time.
So it was organized as a network rather than a kind of central spoke and hub and spoke. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And you can see that trajectory pre-colonial and during the colonial period, when goods are coming into Asia in this part of the world. The different parts of where they are produced on, they produce and they cater for a different taste for an audience. And you will see that, what we call as export art or cross-cultural art, when an object from India comes to Southeast Asia, it will further go through another layer of acculturation or assimilation, where then the local artists in this region starts to imitate, copy, and eventually create their own localized version. Then this further goes on perhaps to the Americas or to the West, and how that is being perceived over there. So where we see, something what is really made in say Malacca or Nagasaki might not naturally also be from that place. I mean, it could be made somewhere else, but the port of exit is those port cities that we're referring. So it's very complicated.
So in that sense, that's actually very nuanced, very complicated, and it's a completely new story, because in the old days, the two competing stories were maritime Silk Road. So it was everything from China. Everything was really for serving China. It's just a road, yeah? So this is just a highway. And then there is the Western narrative, that age of discovery. So it used to be nothing wilderness, and it was discovered by the European, and then the European brought the culture to this. What you've been telling us is a completely new story that was not talked about often, that this area was originally a network of sophistication, a network of trade, of knowledge.
And different centers of emporiums, if you like, in a way. I think the larger or the well-known narrative, like, the Maritime Silk Road, One Belt, One Road, the Age of Discovery, I mean, that has been said. But what really has not been brought up in terms of the scholarship is the agents, is the center in Southeast Asia. And we are really at the center of the trade, right? So ships have to be embarked here to have their supplies replenished. The crew, most of the time, are also Asian sailors and crew members as well. And that narrative, unfortunately, has not been in the forefront, and that is something, at least for the ACM, we would like to bring it to the forefront.
Those Asian sailor, they were of what origin? Malay or?
Malay, Filipino, some are Indians, of course, from South Asia. So that part of the story, are often mentioned in passing, but what roles do they play? And eventually, where do they end up with? Did they settle in a foreign land? Did they not? I mean, these are some of the stories that we would like to address. Yes.
No, this is fascinating. Barnabas, now we discover that there is a piece of history that I have not been aware of even kind of 2 years ago. Now, it might be new to you too, but having said that, you have a lot of experience looking at architectural history, urban history, in the light of climate change. So can you tell us a bit about your thoughts, having been told this story by Clement and his colleagues at the Asian Civilization Museum? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful event. As you say, I'm not a specialist in the Kampong, and I'm finding it utterly fascinating to hear more about it from Clement and from your work on the exhibition. My own work comes from the context of the fact that making and running buildings is currently producing almost 40% of all human climate changing emissions. So about 9 years ago, I started to investigate the history of that story, how we got into this mess that we're in today. And the Kampong is obviously before that problem starts. So today's climate changing emissions are the result of burning fossil fuels, coal, gas and oil, for energy. And getting away from that enormous fossil fuel dependence requires an immense change to architecture and urbanism. So I wanted, as a historian, to look back into the past, next slide please, to understand where we came from in terms of our energy use in architecture. And I started looking at the energy costs of different buildings from the past, shown here to the same scale, to get a sense of how energy use had shaped architecture or had influenced architecture. I discovered that the largest building on this slide, the enormous Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, cost around 78 million days of human labour to build. And I converted that into a figure for energy consumption of all those muscles doing all that work, and found that the total energy cost of building the Pyramid of Khufu was less than the lifetime energy consumption of 7 average Americans today. And that seemed to me to be such an important fact that I pursued it further. I discovered, next slide please, that the same amount of energy could be converted into the 50-year lifespan of a building like this to contemporary average standards of energy consumption. So constructing, running and demolishing this building after 50 years would cost the same as, next slide please, the Pyramid of Khufu to build. Here they are to the same scale. So this gave me a sense that we were dealing with a truly enormous story. Next slide please. Louis Sullivan, the famous American architect, proposed what's generally summed up as form follows function. I've corrected it in my next slide to form follows fuel, that energy is the biggest influence on all our architecture and always has been. So next slide, please. The Kampong houses are a wonderful example of how to build buildings which function well in the climate, using local materials and built using muscle power rather than intense heat inputs. So they show this way of building with materials that not only are gentler to procure, but they also, when finished with, rot back into the soil at the end of their life, rather than being treated with poisons or heat to make them last a bit longer in the building and very much longer in a landfill at the end of their life, which is what we now do with materials. Next slide, please. You can see that the state of architecture in England just before the explosion of coal use was very dismal in technical terms compared with today's architecture. These are the windows of a very rich family close to where I live in Liverpool from the 1590s, and you can see that the panes of glass are tiny and terrible in quality. Within a century, next slide please, you were getting windows of this kind of size because it had moved to coal as the energy source, and therefore the heat was cheap and abundant, and you could produce as much glass as there was a market for, and the more you produced, the cheaper it got. And the same started to apply to fired brick, to iron, and later to steel and concrete and aluminium and plastics, all of which have become the normal materials of architecture worldwide. And as well as revolutionising architecture locally in Britain, this increased coal extraction produced fossil-fuelled British and then European colonialism. It's no coincidence that Britain had some of the closest occurrences of easily mined coal and iron ore and coastal cities. And using these, they formed the largest worldwide empire, using coal-made weapons and manufactured goods to fight and trade their way to an unprecedented spread of colonial power. And as the fossil fuel economics and technology that started in Britain and then Western Europe and America spread and developed around the world, the speed of innovation and technological development has accelerated exponentially. Next slide, please. The result is the mature fossil fuel city worldwide. Beautiful, exciting, creative, hyperactive, but fundamentally in its present form, unsustainable. Next slide, please. Architecture follows this exploding graph of world energy supply very, very clearly and straightforwardly, with a worldwide building boom following the post-colonial globalization. And notice how depressingly large a proportion of this energy use even now is fossil fuels. We talk about sustainability, we're not yet doing it. Next slide, please. It's not just the amount of energy that's changed through the rising world domination of fossil fuels. The usefulness of that energy has also gone up and up. So this is two graphs showing the cost of energy and the cost of light in England since 1300. And you can see that the cost of energy has dropped considerably. The cost of light has dropped by a factor of 14,000 in that period, because we now get so much more benefit for the energy we put in. This is very beguiling and in many ways brings genuine benefits, but at the cost of devastating environmental change already underway and worsening if we don't rapidly decarbonize our energy systems. So the thing I'm so thrilled by today, next slide please, is that you, based in one of the world's great fossil fuel cities, are looking back at your past before colonialism and before fossil fuels to understand what lessons might be learnable from the genuinely zero carbon, circular, sustainable past. Next slide, please. No one is, I think, suggesting that we can or should return literally to that past, but as we look urgently for a zero carbon architecture, we should take it both as a challenge and as an inspiration that people with so much less technology and scientific understanding could produce an architecture that performs so very much better than ours in terms of leaving for succeeding generations a planet worth living on. And perhaps too in terms of quality of life and social and economic justice. Last slide, please. Thank you very much.
If I remember correctly, Barnabas, you're also one of the person to help saving the Marks and Spencer building on Oxford Street and lobbying Michael Gove for refusing the planning application for demolishing the M&S headquarters. So that's also
yes,
that's actually a milestone in the planning history in the UK as well.
Yes, my role in that was just one of many voices speaking out against the entirely unnecessary demolition of a group of 3 buildings in central London, where the replacement would have cost 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And I did the calculation that if you wanted to save that amount of money by taking cold showers every day, which is a tough prospect in the UK, which is much colder and damper, if you wanted to do that, you would need to take cold showers every day for 680,000 years to save that amount of carbon. Or you could retrofit a perfectly decent existing group of buildings rather than demolishing them and replacing them. And it seems that that and other arguments have very gratifyingly won. And yes, we're now in this country starting to move towards retaining existing buildings as much as we can, because it's by far the most low carbon option given the ways we currently build.
Yes. Well, I think coal really has a lot to answer for. In fact, not only climate change, but according to Barnabas, colonialism and all the nasty things that happen afterwards. So, it's really quite a thought-provoking argument, and there is actually quite a lot of things that we need to think through. How can we face the future world? How can we look at our past, the past in Kampong, and see whether that could inspire us to move towards a more sustainable future. Now, we have a few minutes of video from our friend, Dr. Johannes Widodo, at the National University of Singapore. So maybe let's take a look at this video. He was talking about how Kampong inspired him and his colleagues to build the new headquarters building, or the School of Architecture building at the NUS. So now Dr. Widodo, because of a kind of sudden assignment, cannot be in person with us, but we would show his video, and then we could open to the floor and see whether our audience have anything that they would like to comment on or ask. So,
my name is Johannes Widodo. I am from National University of Singapore. This building is a contemporary kampong house. It's a vernacular architecture facing south. The sea is over there. We capture the wind. Very big projected roof. And that projected roof is not just for solar panel, but also for rainwater harvesting. If you look into the plants that we planted there, it's all our native plants. And this native plants is very resilient because it's native. And second, it makes the soil better, softer for better absorption. And third, which is the best, zero maintenance cost. It's very cheap to maintain. And this is a kampong. In kampong, we have the same thing. Even the plants is edible. Even you can get the food on your table taken from your own garden. So if you look into this green wall, you see that these creepers going up just within a few weeks. And this creepers doesn't need maintenance. The green wall doesn't need very expensive equipment, pipings and so on. Very easy to maintain and very cheap. And this kind of plants are everywhere in our kampong. We hide all the lift. Why? Because we want people choose staircase. In the past, in the kampong typology, we don't have lift. We don't have these electrical things. And by making people walking up the staircase, we able to reduce energy. We have a courtyard here, very high ceiling. So the air will move up, the hot air, and then it will be blown by the wind, horizontal wind, from the sea towards the mountain. And this able to create a cool environment. The temperature outside could be 33, 35 degrees centigrade. But here what you feel is not 36 or 38, but something around 24, 25, without air conditioning. And if we need a big gathering room, this is become multi-purpose hall. If you need a dark room, just pull down the screen to the ground and you have a room ready for 200 people here. So I think this multi-purpose space is also another features of a kampong situations. So we live mostly outside, not inside the rooms. But the outside space is not just private space, but it's also a public and semi-public space. And this flexibility of space creates a very efficient use of every square meters of the kampong area. And on that veranda, you can see very clearly how we try to reenact, to make a stilt house look space. And when you look into these 4 pillars, it will remind us about the stilt house kampong typology. This and this is like a Chinese courtyard house, like our shop house typology. The courtyard in the colonial or even traditional or vernacular courtyard house has a function to create a stack effect. So the hot air will go up, and then by the horizontal ventilations, it will blow away the hot air. And this movement of the air from all directions is something that you can feel in a kampong, not just inside the house, but the space in between the kampong. You can see the 3 canopies, you can see the horizon and the port. So that is the port city of Singapore. And also the new industrial, the port city in Tuas on that side. So from here, you can see directly the connections between our vernacular state house typology, our kampong typology, and the modern port city of Singapore. Why? Because we learned about the orientations. We learned about how we try to block the sun from east and west, how to capture wind, how to capture excessive rain, and turn it into something useful, not wasting anything. And that is the ethical principles of the so-called the kampong mentality. Communal living is important. We have the communal space here. This is an ideal space for our students to have lunch, to have interactions among their others, to have rest. And this is also the space that they can fall in love again with nature. But we prove it that it's possible to do a net zero energy building and even positive energy building. So now the Office of Estate have a vernacular building typology. Cross ventilations, self-sustaining energy. Then look into the other old buildings in campus. All the solar panels there. So it's become super low energy building now. And in the next round of renovations, it may become net zero energy building. And this is a way that we say to ourselves, Singapore is a port city kampong. Not because the form is like old kampong, but the old spirit of kampong. The ethics, environmental ethics, social, economical ethics, and cultural ethics is we carry forward into the present situations for the next generations to learn. Through these exhibitions, through the constant exposure into the good narratives and good examples. So everybody, all stakeholders understand how simple it is to achieve net zero waste, to achieve net zero energy, and also to be sustainable. So the connections between the past, the present, and the future is a basic tenet of sustainability. The things that we have today actually is not belong to us. The things that we enjoy today is given by our past generations. And then our mandate from our past generations to pass is on. Nature, culture, architecture, kampong, built environment, to the next generations in a good conditions. If it's broken, we have to fix it. If it's not broken, we have to preserve it. And that is the true spirit of conservation. Because conservation actually is not about nostalgia. Talking about kampong is not about aesthetics. But talking about kampong is to understand the mindset of our predecessors and how this good mindset can be taught to our our present generations, to our children and grandchildren, so they can survive and become a sustainable person for the future.
Yes, unfortunately, Dr. Widodo cannot be with us in person today, but he's got a lot of ideas. He's got a lot of thoughts about how in Singapore or even the rest of civilization, we can learn from tradition, not in a kind of nostalgic mindset, but actually in a forward-thinking mindset. Now, we've got a little bit of time for some question. So if in the audience you have anything you would like to ask, please raise your hand, and then you can ask either Clement or Barnabas, or you can ask both. Or if there is anything you'd like to say, that's fine too. Any question or comment from the audience today? Yes, this gentleman in the blazer.
Hi.
Please also tell us who you are.
Sure. My name is Anupam Yog. I'm a friend of the Oval Partnership, and congratulations on the opening of your new office in Singapore, and it's a beautiful exhibition. I had a question for Barnabas, actually. It was more a curiosity question, because one of the photographs that you shared, the second last slide, had a photograph which had native Bangalore, Singapore mentioned in it. So I was just curious about the context, because I couldn't help notice that. I don't know if you know which picture I'm referring to.
I pinched it from a very good article by that I think I referenced on the slide. That is by Kelvin Anka Eng, The Village View, Recalling the Local Farmhouse. And it's from the National Archives of Singapore, and I don't know anything more about it than that, I'm afraid.
Yes. But it's actually an evidence that there were kind of cross-cultural interaction in Singapore in those days. Any other question? Yes, this gentleman at the back.
Hi, thanks for having this panel discussion today. My question is, there was some mention about there being a reference to the socio-economical status of the Kampong culture that we can want to retain, and that is probably one of the hardest things that
Yes.
a lot of people have realized. Although a lot of charities and community-led initiatives are trying our best to sort of recapture this kind of systems or way of living. I would like to hear the thoughts of the panelists, if they have anything to share regarding these really socio-economical aspects of Kampong culture or sustainability, if they have any ideas. Thank you.
Anyone?
I mean, I don't have a straight answer to your question, and I also agree that this is also one of the most complex issue to tackle in present day's time. But coming from where I'm from, as a sort of curator and art historian, when you look into objects, When you look into some of the, well, we say commodities back in those days, these were traded, whether they are perishable, natural produce, or even commodities as in works of art like furniture, furnishings. The idea of no wastage is there. And then the idea of making use of materials, whether are they mother of pearls, to natural kind of ingredients like lacquer from cultivated from trees, lacquer sap. There is a very conscious effort to bring all these things together, and sometimes objects, if they were made merely as a decorative objects, when they are being imported into another culture, another setting, sometimes they improvise it to make it as a functional object because of its perhaps rarity, and because of, instead of just looking to enjoy it, I want to make it usable as well. So I think the mentality of different cultures in different period of time, the idea of no wastage, and the idea of getting your hands on something that is from lands far away, and you treat it with care, still exists today in perhaps different some parts of cultures and civilization, and in terms of even repairing something that is precious to us. So I think how did that nature of a no wastage of treasuring certain things, certain spirit, like Dr. Widodo was saying, how can we translate it into contemporary practice? That is something, I guess, is a lesson for all of us to think about.
I think it's a fascinating and crucially important question. For me, I find the end results that I can imagine as a society that had learnt the best things from Kampong culture, and I struggle to see the pathway to get us from our current attitudes into those attitudes. But the change of values required is the key thing, because so much of our carbon emission comes from a pursuit of competitive position, of owning more things, and that leads to an unhealthy work culture of excessive hours, where people in hot countries wear Western business clothing, which is inappropriate to the climate, and work right the way through the heat of the day rather than pausing at the most uncomfortable times, and therefore air conditioning is required. And we all compete in all affluent countries to own a tiny bit of property that we can live in, or at least to rent it, and that drives up prices, which means that we work harder, which drives up prices, which means that we work harder, and the amount of good that arises from that is very unclear. The amount of carbon consumption that it causes is absolutely enormous, and to me, the change of values to recognizing that sustainability is a profound need, and much more profound than the need for a newer phone or a bigger telly or whatever it is. These changes in attitude to live more within our means as a society as well as individuals are very fundamental, but they bring real benefits other than just the avoidance of apocalyptic, catastrophic climate change.
So it's really a new mindset, literally, that's what paradigm means. It's actually a new paradigm. I think Barnabas talked about the change of mindset earlier. I think Dr. Widodo talked about new kind of ethics. And it's slightly different from the old ethics that the new civilization of kind of post-carbon civilization would probably call for. There is a gentleman over there in the orange shirt. I think he's been waiting.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Terence. I'm an architect. Just a little bit of trivia. I like to wear Bermudas, like most Singaporeans, to the office. Unfortunately, my office is really cold. I suspect they set the temperature as 18 degrees. And this is very common in Singapore. I always couldn't really understand why it's so cold. So anyway, this is a question for Clement. I'm really interested. I was very intrigued by the word narratives. And almost for Singaporean, narrative governs the way we think about ourselves. So when I was younger, almost at the back of our history lesson, your history sort of started 200 years ago when Stafford Raffles came. Clearly, that has been revised. So I'm interested to know whether you felt that when you look at the artifacts, did most of these development started from the river of Singapore, or it was actually uneven? And this is the first question. The second question is, our identity of the city is very much driven by the narratives we tell ourselves. So there is a lot of understanding of how the core area of Singapore seems to have a lot of history. But I do understand the coastline is very interesting. So if you move leftwards towards Teluk Blangah, it's industrialized, but there are layers there. And I almost feel as if we start to unravel the layers, will that impact the way we think about a city, especially for a city that has for longest time been known as quite soulless or lack of qualities and character?
Again, tough questions, Terence. Terence, right?
Terence, yeah, that's right.
Well, I mean, I guess in a way I can connect with your question because I grew up with that kind of education narrative as well, the 200 years. But, you know, while working in the museums and looking at the collections, and now we have, you know, brilliant scholars and archaeologists who are re-looking into this whole, well, narrative or this whole storyline, this whole history, that we're actually, you know, we have a longer history than what we think, or at least in our generation, what we are being told. And so for the museum, at least, how we start with the entry point is that, you know, if you come in from the archaeological gallery, then the story is like what you said, you know, it starts with the Singapore River. And that Singapore River, whatever that we have uncovered, already told us that there is a 700-800 years history that you know, predates what we have learned that it started when the arrival of the British. So that's the entry point. But of course, there is also a wider international entry point, which is much more older, and that's through the shipwreck, the Tang shipwreck collection, and that dates to the 9th century. And it talks about a shipwreck, for those of you who are not aware. It's a collection of about 60,000 objects. It's datable to the 9th century that talks about trade between then the Tang Dynasty China, because the ship itself carries Chinese commodities, mainly Chinese ceramics. And based on, again, evidence from the archaeological discovery, the ship itself is an Arabian dhow. So it would have been corresponding with the Middle East back in those days, the Abbasid Empire, which is Iraq and Iran today. So there has been trade exchange. And again, Southeast Asia is the center point of the connection. The ship that makes such a big journey would have to stop in different parts of the coastal line. Again, how it sunk in this part of the region, we don't know. We're still, you know, looking into it. But these are the larger narrative. I think we want to expand up the narrative to show that, you know, we might not know a lot about our history as yet, but things have changed in the past. In the past 10, 15 years, how much have we discovered? And I think it also needs time to develop and establish all these things that you and I are curious about. And I can only hope that we will get there at some point.
One
hello.
last question.
Yeah, it's not
the lady
really,
in the middle. Yeah.
not really a question, just a comment from a completely different field. I work in mental health, and actually, I really do think that is a very important question, and maybe the most important question: how are we going to get there, right? So actually, right, really in the mental health field, we're seeing a lot of climate grief. The word grief, like. When listening to that, I almost cried today, and like I don't really know anything about it, but I think we're all really sad about that our Mother Earth is in such pain, and like it's not shameful to feel that as an inhabitant, as an animal, as a Homo sapien, and like it is so. The fact that all of us are feeling a bit unsettled now, right? Like Homo sapien, really, I think that maybe that's where the answers lie. Maybe we don't have to work in silo. Maybe like all our disciplines also, like I want to study eco-psychology, and like I don't think mental health should be a completely unrelated field. I think that it's very related because there's a mental health epidemic. And like you all said, it's unsustainable. Why does the UN have so many sustainability goals? Not just environmental, because everything is interconnected. And I really do think we have so much intelligence, so many resources, so many professionals, so many fields, and we're all feeling the same climate grief. We're all feeling the same yearning, the same nostalgia, the same human condition. We don't want to go back to the past wholesale, obviously, not per se, but we want to, like Dr. Widodo said, connect the past, present, future. And like, I think, Chris, you asked a really, really important question. Will we get there? I believe we'll get there if we want to get there. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Yes. No, that's a really important food for thought. Now, in fact, it's good that questions are actually getting very poignant, and then comments are getting very insightful. But we're actually already 10 minutes, 15 minutes overrun. So in the interest of time, I would really have to draw our discussion today to a close, reluctantly. But before we all leave this room, looking forward to the future, can I ask today our two guests, in your mind, looking towards the future, what would be the few keywords that you would conjure up in your mind about what a more sustainable future city would look like? Your mental picture, as the lady just talked about. I think it's about how we can realign our mind and the body and the nature. So in your mind, what would be the key words, the key picture that you can conjure up? Yeah.
Barnabas, would you like to go first?
Okay. Yeah, it's obviously a fabulously important question. I think the most promising vision of the future that I can think of is for the city to look as much like itself now as it can, in the sense that new buildings are so problematic. Our dependency on concrete, cement is responsible for 8% of all world carbon emissions. And steel for buildings is in the same kind of ballpark. So our dependency on concrete, steel, glass, aluminium and plastics is catastrophic and currently fairly inescapable. Even that wonderful project we were seeing at NUS was made of concrete and steel. Keeping the existing buildings we have is a massively important first step, and retrofitting them to perform better, more passively, much less air conditioning, much better sun shading, and a kind of willingness from us to adapt around what we have, rather than to assume that we depend for our viability as human beings on, as one of the wonderful interventions from the audience said, 18-degree temperatures in Singapore and 22-degree temperatures in winter in Britain, which is just insane. Both are uncomfortable in that context. So adapting ourselves around our buildings and our cities, rather than adapting them around us, is the low carbon option. And it comes from, as that wonderful last intervention from the audience suggested, a change in values and priorities, where we acknowledge to ourselves the fragility of our planet. We come to a real understanding of ourselves as not all-powerful agents of change in the world, but as creatures that are dependent on the ecosystems around us, and therefore beauty changes. So I would have accepted your kind invitation to fly and be there in person like a shot a few years ago, and now I realize that even more beautiful than a visit to your wonderful city is the experience of not flying long haul. And these changes in our values and our understandings of the world are the crucial thing. So our cities will feel like kind of lighter touch adaptations of their current selves, and the new materials will be bamboo and thatch and other untreated, locally sourced, quick-growing circular materials that can be dug back into the soil at the end of their lives.
Thank you. Clement.
I think it's a bad choice to ask you to go first because you kind of rounded up better than I could. You gave a very pragmatic solution. You also gave a very human side of things. Yeah, it's true. Well, in my take, you asked for a keyword, right? I think then I would go with the less pragmatic, but it's something that is a little bit more universal, which we all should also think about. And it's like the last point you mentioned, it's the change of mindset, as what our audience said. And for me, then my keyword is to be more compassionate, and to be more compassionate in a way of being sustainable. It's how do we achieve that? And being compassionate in a way is also being kind to ourselves. Maybe we don't switch on our work laptops at night. We don't have to handle all this unnecessary stress of work-related matters. Can we do that? Can we detach ourselves from doing that? I think then it's a test for all of us in today's day of age. But yes, how do we be kinder to ourselves, to our friends, our colleagues, and at the same time be kinder to the planet that we live in.
So be more compassionate. On that note, I think we have to close our discussion for this evening, and let us thank our panelists, Dr. Barnabas Calder and Mr. Clement Ong. And last but not least, thank you very much for you've been such a wonderful audience this evening, and we hope we'll see you again very soon in some other of our events. Thank you very much indeed, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.